Greetings to the people of St. Stephen's, West Vancouver and St. Christopher's on this third Sunday of Lent. When I graduated from university with my teaching and music degrees, I went to India to teach at an international Christian boarding school in the Himalayan mountains. Little did I know how transformative the next 5 years would be in my life, as the expectations and assumptions with which I had been taught, shaped, and formed would be challenged in the midst of another culture, other ways of living, and different expectations. Little did I realize how much I took for granted as right and good, only because it was familiar. Living in India with such a rich, complex history in its own right, overlaid with British colonialism, and with two major religious worldviews side by side with a tiny Christian minority, required my constant reflection on what I understood to be good, necessary, important, or changeable. A very small example: water was inconsistently available on the side of that Himalayan mountain. It was pumped up from springs on the other side of the mountain and then ran down by gravity on our side, filling tanks up from the bottom of the community to the top. If the power was out, there was no pump, no water, and power outages were frequent. I would wake up and have no water for a shower or the toilet, and always had to have buckets of water on standby for cooking and cleaning. I found this incredibly frustrating, as I was used to urban Canada, where water was plentiful, clean, and never ran out. My frustration would make me grumpy all day with students and other staff, acting in ways inconsistent with the faith I professed. Until I stopped and asked why I expected that I deserved the privilege of constant water access. I had to reframe my expectations and examine my sense of entitlement and be clear about what was truly important. My frustration at something that was not mine was spilling over and did not reflect the mercy, compassion, and grace of the God I said I served. So what does that have to do with Lent or the scriptures for today? I think Lent is all about reframing our lives, all about understanding who we are through the wisdom of God, the one who created us and all that is, the one who loves us from the very beginning, the one who constantly reaches out in relationship with us from Adam and through every generation, the one who shared with Moses the commandments that would help shape that relationship with God and with each other, and the one who came in the person of Jesus to show us what the love looks like when it's lived in the midst of daily choices. St. Paul knew that living the wisdom of God could only be seen through the death and resurrection of Jesus, reframing everything in his life through the lens of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. Something that was so counter to everything that neither the Jews or the Greeks expected it as a source of wisdom. It was the foolishness of God, that love could interpret the law, that God can be trusted even in the face of death to bring new life. Jesus knew that in the core of his being. He knew God so intimately that he could see beyond social norms to have a conversation with a Samaritan woman at the well. He could see beyond the exclusion of the Gentiles to to respond to the need for healing of a child. He could see beyond the rules and traditions of Sabbath keeping to heal and bring wholeness. He could fill the law with reinterpretations through love. He could leave behind crowds of people clamoring for him in order to be alone in prayer with the source of his hope and strength in God. He could trust God in a storm, in an angry crowd, in the face of illness or death, and even on a cross. And he could face the misunderstanding of the disciples who thought that his success in preaching and healing was the whole point. He could face the ridicule and opposition of religious leaders who saw him only as one breaking the traditions and causing trouble. He could face the political leaders who accepted that he was a threat because he was the center of conflict, even though they knew he was not directly an insurrectionist. Jesus faced ridicule, opposition, anger, fear, that ultimately led to those around him plotting to get rid of him. It was much easier to get rid of him than to listen or change. We hear echoes of that in religious and political leaders today. It's hard to hear through the biases we already have to see in only one way. If staying in power is your primary purpose, then you become a Putin or a Mugabe and kill the opposition and seduce others to see your way is best. It's in the echoes of our resistance to really seeing the effects of racism, anti-Black or anti-Indigenous. And in the echoes of our resistance to seeing the effects of poverty around us. Brian McLaren, a theologian and author, writes about all the biases we have or may have during our lifetime that stop us from seeing with enough freedom to choose well for God's way. A few examples: confirmation bias, where we judge new ideas based on the ease with which they fit in and conform with the only standard we have, old ideas, old information, and trusted authorities. As a result, our framing story, our paradigm excludes whatever doesn't fit. Or community bias. It's almost impossible to see what our community doesn't, can't, or won't see. Comfort or complacency bias. I prefer not to have my comfort disturbed, thank you. Cash bias. It's hard for me to see something when my way of making a living requires me not to see it. And conspiracy bias. Under stress or shame, our brains are attracted to stories that relieve us, exonerate us, or portray us as victims of malicious conspirators. I recognize these and other biases as ones I know that I have thought or voiced or practiced. Lent is the time for self-examination of our biases. Which people is God asking us to hear in a new way? Self-knowledge is the first and necessary entranceway to wisdom. Richard Rohr, a Roman Catholic Franciscan, says this: everyone sees the world from a certain defined cultural perspective, but people who have done their inner work also see beyond their own biases to something transcendent, something that crosses the boundaries of culture and individual experience. Certainly our church, and myself in particular, in my self-examination, I'm constantly learning to listen in a new way to the Indigenous people of Canada in particular. The gospel can find expression in any culture or tradition. Will we be open to new ways, like gospel-based discipleship, providing a door for us? Will we listen to Black and racialized people in our church to hear their pain and know that we have a problem? Our council of General Synod is not diverse, not for want of good people, but for want of eyes to see and elect Black, Asian, mixed race, and South Asian Anglicans to our synods, and for want of eyes to welcome Black, Asian, South Asian, and mixed race clergy into parish leadership, or to discern with them for ordained ministry. Will we hear the call for justice for everyone, and especially those so essential to our well-being during this COVID time? Will we share the call for equitable distribution of the vaccine for COVID worldwide, or only in our own neighborhood or family? Will we acknowledge and respect transgender people in our midst with the pronouns they prefer, or only the ones we think they should prefer? A Pharisee entered the temple and saw the availability of all the correct kinds of animals for ritual sacrifice that the law demanded, saw the temple money being handled appropriately, and knew that what was needed for the necessary demands of the law were available. Jesus entered the temple and saw the noise and chaos cluttering up the area of the temple supposed to be reserved and available for the Gentiles to come and pray. And now there was hardly room for that, no quiet, spacious opportunity to be with God. Jesus saw some taking profit for what was meant to be a gift from the heart to God. And despite the risk, he tackles the tables and disrupts the proceedings to make a point. When the Pharisees question him about destroying the temple, he refers to the 3 days when it will be rebuilt. He draws on the first 2 verses of Hosea 6. Come, let us return to the Lord. He has torn us to pieces, but he will heal us. He has injured us, but he will bind up our wounds. After 2 days he will revive us. On the 3rd day he will restore us, that we may live in his presence. And even then, in that time of the Hebrew Scriptures, there was an expectation that the character of God was such that he will restore us. And of course, the Gospel of John was written many, many years after the death and resurrection of Jesus, and clearly draws on that sense of Jesus' resurrection on the 3rd day. In these 3 days, the focus would shift from the building, the temple, to the incarnational reality of God in human form, God in us and among us, calling us to see God's way, the way of transformation, justice, mercy, compassion, forgiveness, and love, through human beings first, not buildings or institutions, not even our beloved religious institutions. Self-examination is the starting place. Inviting God to open our eyes to see as God sees, open our ears to hear what God hears, open our hearts to respond as Jesus did, willing to release biases and risk all to create space for the kingdom. The psalmist calls us to that with clarity today. But who can detect their errors? Clear me from hidden faults. Keep back your servant also from the insolent. Do not let them have dominion over me. Then I shall be blameless and innocent of great transgression. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my Redeemer. Amen.